Hi everybody, welcome back. So good to be seen by you. Wish I could be seeing you. Today we are going to talk about a very important and interesting group when we're learning about diversity in the workplace, older adults. Of course, there are more and more older adults alive in comparison to other groups than ever before, and this number is growing, growing, growing. They're the fastest growing portion of our population, and they're working longer and longer. And when I say older adults, which I'm going to throughout this unit, the official cutoff is 65 and older. But as we'll talk about, that number isn't always incredibly important when we're talking about identity and interaction. Okay. So once again, I have a Word document up for you that I thought might be useful for you in filling in my notes. I'm going to move in and out of the chapter, and I will work to be really clear about when I'm moving in and out in case you have your book with you and you're keeping track of that. So let's start off. Mary Lily Hummer writes that age is fluid rather than fixed. Put differently, this means that we move through age incrementally. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's interval data, but we think of it as categorical data. Young adult, adolescent, middle adult, middle-aged, old, and yep, even researchers use this label of old. That's for those who are 80 and older, officially speaking. But we have these ideas in our brain about when these transitions occur. That's why we make a big deal out of like 40 or 50th birthdays, but not out of like a 27th birthday, because that's not an age that we tend to have stick out in our minds. Anyway, when looking at this as an intergroup phenomena and addressing diversity in this way, I want you to recognize / remember that both the self-identification of the person, what category do I think I am in, is important, and the observers' categorization of them. So the categories that I place other people into, are they young? Are they old? Are they old? That's incredibly consequential for cognitions, emotions, and behavior. So all of these are important for studying and understanding age identity as it corresponds with attitudes, stereotypes, and result to communication. But again, a lot of what we're going to talk about is about other people's placement of us into categories, and this of course makes so much sense from an intergroup perspective, right? Why we would look at that way, and the empirical research lines up. Okay, so next big point here, let's talk about age attitudes. So until 3/4 of the way into the chapter, Dr. Hummer almost brushes over this fact, but it's really important, that negative attitudes abound when it comes to older adults. Our perceptions of older adults. Some of you took this IAT at the beginning of the semester, and perhaps you want to revisit the website and take the old, young IAT now. And when you do, you'll see that there is a strong and moderate preference for young over old. That is the common response. You'll get your feedback at the top, and then it'll give you a breakdown of how people tend to score, and this just prevails no matter how much they update it. This is the case that this is true. This idea that we prefer young to old, this is true even among older adults themselves. And just like we see in other marginalized groups, yes, there is some of that in-group bias, that they're older, so they're going to have less negative ideas than, say, a younger group, a true out-group. But there is less excitement about seeing oneself as part of that group, and even older adults say that it's better to be young than it is to be old, and they think more positively about young people than they do older people. Okay, so we can ask about attitudes. As researchers, we can figure out attitudes through the IAT and that stereotype association that gives us an idea, or we could even give a measure that's incredibly simple, such as a feeling thermometer. This is a little picture of a thermometer that we give participants, and we ask them to just rate how warmly or how positively they feel toward a group. And 0 is really cold, and 100 is like incredible warmth, as warm as you can get toward a group. How that attitude toward them, and people rate their attitudes in that way. So a really simple way to gauge attitudes. So when we do it that way, consistently people are going to rate the young people as warmer than what they rate older adults. And we see, in terms of attitudes, this negative sentiment about older people is also connected to a fear of aging, psychological aging, physical aging. And everyone isn't petrified of growing older, but it is a theme of being afraid and not wanting to get older and to experience things that we associate with getting older. Okay, so now let's move on to stereotypes of older adults. Note the different stereotypes and the stereotype typologies presented here in the table. These show how our views of older adults aren't just reserved for one prototype. We talked about prototypes before, or even an exemplar, a real person. We have several different, I would call them caricatures, of whom older adults are, and these expand as we get older. This difference in the frequencies of stereotypes held by young people versus older people is a nice reminder that the more stereotypes we have of a group doesn't necessarily mean we think worse of them. That's what we say colloquially a lot, like, oh, I have a lot of stereotypes, it must be bad. Well, yes, stereotyping is not something to be applauded, but having more stereotypes as opposed to fewer indicates a wider schema for that group. When we see groups having a lot of stereotypes instead of few, we see more variability there, right? They can be different than just this one type, one person. So this is, you'll recall, this actually a more positive position to be in terms of treatment of a certain group. So it makes sense older adults would have a few more stereotypes than younger people would. So having few incredibly simple set of stereotypes, you really do reject that variability. That tends to be incredibly bad. So you see that table in there, and that's really useful information to draw from. You might want to write about that in some of your today, the papers, the discussion post you're going to put for this week, and then also in papers down the road. So back to the chapter. Pay close attention to the stereotypes listed here as being held about older adults. Think of the ones which seem similar to your own thinking about older people, which ones are surprising. Now, as we branch away from this chapter for a minute, I want to add some depth to your understanding of stereotypes as they relate to emotions and to behavior. I want to talk about older adults' placement on a very empirically sound theoretical model. First, we will talk about this model. It's the bias map. We're going to talk generally about it, and I'm going to talk about each of these figures. So talk about the first figure for a while, and then after we talk about that, I'm going to talk to you about older adults' placement on the bias map in that second figure. So if you aren't a picture person, if that's not how you learn, that's not your learning style, don't worry. I'll talk through everything so that you can take notes that make sense to you, okay? Someone who makes sense with the notes. So the two figures are shown on your worksheet. Both of these are from the seminal piece of the bias map and are found on page 634 and 638 respectively in that piece that I have in the reference section. So the bias map asserts that two dimensions of stereotype, warmth and competence, can be incredibly useful in helping us understand the emotions and behavioral responses toward target outgroups. In just a few more steps than asking someone how they feel about an outgroup, like I mentioned earlier with that feeling thermometer example, that gets attitudes. But in just a few more steps, with just a few more questions about what do you think about this group, what do you think about that group, you can find out so much about how people see a group, how they feel about them, their thoughts about them, and how they probably treat that group. So to be clear, all of this data that is shown in the second figure when we get to it, and that I'll be talking about, comes from asking people about their perceptions of groups of people. So this data comes from American participants, a nice wide array of them, but the stuff I'm reporting about older adults is pretty consistent across cultures, despite some of the prominent notions about the Eastern Hemisphere being far less ageist than the Western. That's not so true. Okay, so let's dig in here. So let's look at the figure. On the Y and then the N axes of the table. Let's start with warmth, that Y-axis. Warmth. Warmth indicates the character, the good versus bad nature that is thought to be held about a particular group, how warm that group is. While warmth and competence, that x-axis, are important, warmth is more important, because if a group is perceived by outsiders as warm, those outsiders will not perceive the group as being malicious. That's pretty, imagine that. That's pretty important, how we see groups. So high warmth coincides with really active behaviors as opposed to passive. Warmth goes with these active behaviors. So if you're high warmth, I'm going to be actively helpful to you. The passive behaviors go with the competence we'll talk about in a minute. But so high warmth is the best place for a group to be in terms of how other people perceive them and their treatment of them. Low warmth is the worst thing that a group can have placed on them, because groups that are considered low warmth receive active harm from their perceivers, from their observers. To be low in your warmth, to be perceived as low warmth, means that you aren't seen as having good character. And so the perceiver is not going to be trusting, will always make negative attributions for behaviors, etc., 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 lots of bad things. So again, in terms of society's opinions of social groups, high warmth is the most important to the treatment you'll receive. It's the best kind of treatment. Low warmth coincides with the worst kind of treatment. Don't get me wrong, with my language, I just need to be so clear here, and I don't want to belabor it. I'm not implying that this is somehow up to the target or the targeted group. As we learned previously, stereotyping doesn't have to come from what a group is actually doing. It's in the eyes of the stereotype holders. And as a matter of fact, the same behavior, if that behavior even is being exhibited by a group, such as being good with money, this can be perceived as low in warmth or high in warmth, depending on the perceiver's positioning of the outgroup on the map. I just want to be super clear on that. This is all about what that observer, that other person thinks about that social group, wants to think about them. Okay. So that covers warmth, and it shows you, I've described to you, just as the figure shows, that the behaviors that coincide, these active behaviors, either active positive or active negative, active pro-social or active antisocial. Okay, so moving on to competence. So the competence dimension tells us how skilled, wise, capable a group is perceived to be. Looking again at this first figure, you can see where the perceived competence of a group drives more passive behaviors, such that highly competent groups seen as highly competent, are passively facilitated, passively helped. So passive facilitation involves things like allowing people to join an event. It's not as if you reach out to them, go out of your way to give of yourself, give something, provide support of some kind. That's active facilitation. But you're passively encouraging, just very minimal effort, convenient effort, to include, to accept, or even listen to that outgroup. For low competence groups, those perceived to be really unskilled, unintelligent, incompetent, we passively harm them. We passively harm them? What? Passive harm? What is that? Well, things like not even acknowledging their presence, sort of forgetting that they're there. This is one that I don't know if you're struggling with it, but people do from time to time. My students struggle with this sometimes. My undergraduates a lot will ask me questions about this. They'll say, is not acknowledging someone a form of just discrimination? What are you saying here? That I'm harming someone by not being nice to them? Okay. So let's just think about this. Let's try and put ourselves in the position of the group or the person even feeling this way. My response to them is, did you ever really care about someone, maybe even someone you loved in a romantic relationship, and they went from being actively angry at you and voicing that and being passionate about you, that active harm almost, okay, ugh, you drive me crazy, to very passively not giving a crap about you? Oh, pardon my language. Or did you ever belong to a group that other people spoke of that group and said, I didn't even notice that you were here. I forgot about you. Or I don't even think about you. Does that feel good? I think you get my point. Those things feel awful. So this passivity coincides with competence, okay? The passive dimensions, high or low. And again, these have lessened importance when compared to warmth, which designates those active treatments in a pro-antisocial way. But but they still are consequential for how we treat people, okay? So each of these, warmth and competence, help us understand these behavioral communicative responses that people have to us, okay? So where the groups that we belong to, when people perceive us as part of those groups, how warm and competent they think those groups are is going to influence how they feel about us and how they behave toward us. And these things go together. I'm not saying that the warmth or competence is the driving force. And I've already given you some examples of how emotion, for instance, could drive it. Okay, so this helps us, bias map helps us understand how behavioral and emotional and cognitive responses, they all work together. The first table shows you the emotions that we have for each of the quadrants. And perhaps all of these are self-explanatory and very intuitive to you, but I want to point out what a strong driver emotions are. I want to just talk about that for a moment. If we feel, for instance, an intense emotion, that emotion, as human beings, is very likely to drive everything. Even if our intellect tells us otherwise, we're taking in data that's telling us something different from what our emotions are saying. But our emotions are powerful. We are likely to act in accordance with that emotion. And then shift our thinking to correspond. And of course, that's why very persuasive people are persuasive many times by playing on our emotions, right? Getting our emotions riled up. Because if you can get people's emotions in it, then they'll form their thinking to correspond with those emotions, okay? Many of us are going to let our emotions drive us rather than our logical thinking. And the stronger the emotions we feel, the more adamant we are in structuring or restructuring our thinking. So again, all of these emotions are probably self-explanatory when you look at those quadrants and you see what those are. It makes sense, for instance, why we would admit groups that are both competent and warm. I'm so sorry, admire, not admit. Admire groups that are both competent and warm. And we would envy groups if we saw them as really competent but not warm, because, they have the things that we want, but we don't have. Well, they have them because they don't care about people like we do. So you see how that works, and our emotions make us feel threatened and envious of them. And that corresponds to, they must not be good people, but they're smart people. We have to watch out for them. I really want to spend some time, though, on this upper left-hand quadrant. Even though for your papers and things like that, you might choose to come back to this bias map and tap into some of the other quadrants. I want to spend some time on that upper left-hand, your mirrored image, the upper left-hand quadrant where a group is perceived as having high warmth and low competence. These groups are met with emotions of pity. When we see people as good people, high warmth, but just not capable, low competence, then we certainly don't see them as a threat. If we did see them as a threat, we'd never see them as high warmth. And so we'd shift them to another quadrant. That would work for us. But here's another chance to remind you that a group's place on the quadrant isn't really about what the group is doing. It's about how they're perceived. And a group goes from a non-threat to a threat, for instance, maybe because a leader conjured up some believable tall tales we want to believe, about a certain group getting all the jobs and stealing them from us, for instance, then that scares us, and we'll push them into another quadrant so we can feel and treat them as we please. Okay? So, back to this upper left-hand quadrant. In this upper left-hand quadrant, the warmth we perceive keeps us from treating them with outward aggression, hatred, harm. It keeps it from getting nasty, because remember, warmth is the more important, right? And they're high warmth, so we're going to be actively helpful. Great. Cool. But the low competence coincides with our pity. What brings out the pity. So let's look at the second figure that I put on your worksheet in the Word document. See the elderly there? There they are. They're over there in the upper left-hand corner. Those are our older adults. Study after study finds them here. Study after study shows that people, when asked about older adults, report that they are very warm, but they're not very capable or competent. So while we in our everyday talk say things about older people, that they are wise, that they have so much to teach us, much of the data suggests that as a group, we don't really perceive them this way. As the other models of this chapter describe in greater detail, because they come from COP scholars, yay, older adults are patronized. So they get into more of the communication of they're patronized. They're patronized to an extreme degree. We feel pity, sympathy, these for them, and we certainly don't want to be them. The circles on the second figure represent the results of a statistical plot in which the groups within the same circle are similar to each other in terms of the perceptions people have of them. Put differently, the ways that the general public perceives the elderly is the same as how they perceive groups who have physical and or mental impairments. The labels that they use in there are ones that they use with participants. Those are colloquial words, especially as data is collected. Some of this data is collected decades prior, but we do more recent data. So being old is equated to being incapable. And the emotions that we feel coincide with the treatment of older people as nice but not savvy. So next bullet, there was a lot in there. We covered the what the warmth and competence really mean, why they're important. Warm is more important than competence, and it goes with the active, and competence is still important, but a little bit less important, and so it's equated to these more passive behaviors. So we've talked about all that and how the emotions are the strongest driver, but all these, the emotions, the behavior, and the stereotypes, the cognitions about groups, they all work together so that when we see where a group is on a quadrant, it's a really good map that we have for how we're going to be biased against them, or to how we're going to treat them. Okay, so communication response to older adults. So I want to give you some of the general trends and behaviors here. So jumping ahead a bit in terms of the chapter, I want to talk about the specific communication behaviors that are more commonly communicated to older than to younger adults. Many of these are described on page 47. First, elder speak. This is the kind of dependent supporting and independent stifling communication that many have with older adults. Let's say we have a young adult interacting with an older adult. It just helps to keep it simple in describing what's going on here. So the young adult wants to help the older adult, that active help, active facilitation. And they feel sorry for him. And if the older adult says, I can do it myself, the younger adult, more so than if they were interacting with another younger person, is going to reject that, I can do it myself. Just reject it, discount it. And say something like, oh no, that's silly, let me help you. It's nice enough, right? But it still squelches independence. Conversely, when an older adult says something to communicate his or her dependence, like, can you help me with this? Or I could really use your help. Or even, I'm old and can't do this. The younger adult is encouraging of that. Says, oh, of course, yes. So we're encouraging the dependence far more than we're encouraging the independence. If this sounds similar to how many people are with small children, then yeah, I'm sorry to say you're right. So when we say, oh, here, let me just tie your shoes, you're taking forever. Yep, it's quite similar, and it is disempowering. So other examples are patronizing talk. Have you ever been patronized? It's pretty awful. An example is telling someone who's being incredibly serious, professional, perhaps at work, that he or she is cute. This is like a common thing that we do when we patronize. Like, oh, isn't that so cute that you social scientists want to learn statistics? How precious. Calling it cute calls out the warmth, and lack of other comments is the competence, right? We don't take cute people seriously if that's all we're saying about them. Okay? More examples of this, what we do for older people more than younger people. Baby talk. Yes, using words like potty waddy instead of bathroom, and other babyish words that we would use for small children, and maybe not even all small children, calling body parts silly words. Also talking to an older person like you're talking to a baby with that same sing-song, like, hi, how you doing? Inflection. Again, we see this with other groups who are in the same upper left-hand quadrant receiving this pity. We see this elder speak, this babyish talk. Another example is over-accommodation. To accommodate appropriately would be to slow down ever so slightly in speech patterns, to speak clearly, to maintain eye contact. Let the older adults see your lips move. Use simpler sentence structures as opposed to long and complex sentences with many phrases. All of those behaviors I just mentioned would account for the normative changes that older adults experience, such as slight lessening of hearing, slow, gradual loss of short-term memory. Those are normative things. Those are things that normally decline at a very slow rate as we age. And so if you make slight changes, especially if you're someone who normally talks a mile a minute like I do, or uses really long phrases like I do, being mindful to slow it down a little bit and adjust slightly, that's accommodating. Because that's a normative change. Or perhaps asking them oh, is that too fast? Let me slow down. That's accommodation. But over accommodation is abundant when communicating with older adults. So younger people tend to yell, talk at an incredibly slow rate, use sentences as simple as 3-word sentences. All of these are over accommodations. They overdo it. Also, it's incredibly common to avoid interesting, deep, important conversation topics and just stick to a very narrow set of old people topics. The last of these, of course, is not a nonverbal accommodation. It's the actual topic of conversation. Don't forget about this one. I often hear my undergraduate students in my communication aging class say things like, I can't talk to older people, even my grandparents, about things like politics or sex or religion, or even the really deep, tough things that are going on in my life. When I ask why not, you've known them a long time. They're part of your family. You care deeply for each other. They say, it would make my grandparent feel really uncomfortable. Or, that would be really disrespectful. Or, they don't want to talk about that. They'd rather talk about sad things like death or the bad health. Now, I get some of that, okay? And some of it may be true, okay? But encouragingly, often, students talk about, over the course of the semester, and thinking about these things and putting themselves in an older adult's shoes and things like that, and learning about these things, that they look deep inside themselves and really evaluate their own motivations. They realize that, if all they talk about are simple topics, they're not developing a deep relationship. They miss opportunities to learn about each other, to argue, to grow. And I ask them to think closely about their own conversation behaviors, and they do. And many of them say, I've always got it in my mind that the older adult was initiating these conversations about bad health and other old people topics. We call these painful self-disclosures, talking about all the dark, the awful things. And sometimes young people say, I always thought that was what my grandparent did. But now I realize that I've avoided talking about other things that are interesting, important, and meaningful. And I've gone back to things like, so, how's that bad hip, Grandma? I have initiated these conversations. I have limited it because of my narrow thinking about what old people talk about. So when we look at transcripts of interactions with older adults, we see this pattern emerging quite a lot. Now, shouldn't we assume that older people with more years to live have led interesting lives, just like we lead interesting lives? Maybe even, given that they've had more time, maybe even some extra interesting things we haven't experienced yet. Maybe we could mutually benefit from moving beyond old people topics. And because all, young and old, tend to give into these stereotypes of old age, maybe it would be useful to push each other, coax us to get real and to get deep. Okay. So next I want to talk about what's the starting point of ageist communication and what are some models of communication in aging. Seeing someone as old, that's the starting point. Much of this comes from the face, and the old age cues that we see. It could also come from things like the voice. When we hear a voice and the voice is changing, it sounds older to us, more broken up, more raspy. But it's not about how old you are. It's about how old people think you are when they look at you, when they start that interaction with you. That's what spurs on the models that we're going to talk about. And so both of these models, the communication predicament of aging model and the age stereotypes interaction model, start with those physical signs of old age cues. One of these, the age stereotype and interaction model, is supported in its claim that the older you look, the more stereotyping, and that the resultant communication is going to be negative. No wonder it's so common for people to enact the social mobility strategy of dyeing their hair and using wrinkle cream. So, the first of these models, communication predicament of aging model. This is covered more thoroughly on page 45. This model demonstrates that when we meet someone that we determine to be in the old person social category, our stereotypes and expectations lead us to alter our speech patterns. These alterations at first might make the perceived older person frustrated. They might actually become frustrated, might become angry, and certainly constrain the conversation. The older person's response is filtered through, whatever that older person does is filtered through this same narrow stereotypical thinking. So if the older person, we perceive as older, gets upset about our pitiful talk or patronizing talk, we'll just see that as confirming our stereotypes. Old biddy, old curmudgeon. And then we'll take that negative reaction with us the next time we see an older adult and keep building this idea like, yeah, older people, they can be real cranky. The cycle continues and continues until ultimately the older person, even if he or she was resistant at first, just concedes. He or she gives in to the notion that he or she is less worthy of meaningful, deep human conversations. This is why older adults, sometimes in like a poor nursing home without as many resources, for instance, are oftentimes said to age quickly. You can't age quicker or faster. All of us age at the same rate. But what we mean is they seem older because the signs of aging have dramatically increased. They seem to be less capable of doing things on their own. They look and they behave in a more frail way. It's because they've been communicated to in a way so very different from how we communicate with other people. And this has ultimately led to their limited communication and assumed dependent roles opposed to independent. Now, I'm not saying that those things don't happen naturally as we age, but what happens is through our communication with older people, these things I've been talking about, it increases the rate at which these things occur, these negative things, these disempowering, dependent things. If lots of people treat someone like a warm and incompetent person, even when that's not who that person truly is, they will ultimately concede. Some of this is demonstrated through the studies of self-stereotyping, like those that are noted on page 50, in which older adults actually give in to the stereotypes. Give in, but that is what it is, to the stereotypes about themselves, and it causes them to perform worse on memory tasks, have more cardiovascular stress, and be less likely to advocate for resources for older adults for their own groups. They essentially buy into this fabricated and inflated idea of what old age does to our bodies and to our minds. So, that's the CPA. Side point here. Why do I keep saying older adults? Well, that's as vanilla term as you're going to get. Terms like elderly, even old person, and the very popular senior citizen have connotations of frailty. When we say older adult, we are sort of reminding people that older adults are still adults. And as you can see from the research we're relaying to you through the chapter and through my lecture, this is a quite necessary shift, given how we tend to think about and communicate with older people. All right, so model 2, age stereotype and interaction model. The CPA does get more attention by researchers, but the APIM, the ASIM is incredibly useful in describing how older adults who are stereotyped positively, like the golden ager or someone, maybe not our grandparent, but a perfect grandparent stereotype, they tend to experience fewer of the negative communication behaviors that I've mentioned. According to this model, these positively stereotyped individuals are communicated to normally, similarly to how you would communicate with anyone else. Maybe some appropriate accommodations, but pretty similar to how you talk to young people, how you talk to anybody. Those stereotyped negatively in the age stereotype and interaction model are going to be things like the curmudgeon or the self-centered stereotype. Those are going to experience those more extreme ageist communication behaviors. So in a sense, age stereotype and interaction model takes
let's see what we can find.
It looks at the positive things.
I found something on the web.
Sorry, that was my phone. It looks at those positive things that the communication predicament of aging model doesn't, but then it also includes what the communication predicament of aging model does. It replicates that about the more negative stereotypes like the curmudgeon, self-centered older person. They're going to experience those more extreme ageist communication behaviors. I like this model because it includes those positive communication exchanges in which we treat older adults as people, as we would everybody else. and they reciprocate those ways that confirm this in us. And so we have this nice cycle where we keep interacting with older people in meaningful, deep, interesting ways. In a sense, then, those positive interactions move the older adult, younger adult exchange from an intergroup exchange to a more interpersonal one. Yes. Okay, a few words about this week's activity. Please really think critically about your own cognitions and communication. One reason why I love researching prejudices surrounding older adulthood is that people, so sad to say, are so quick to be ageist. And they're so open about their ageism. So you can really get in there and show them, and they learn from it, and they're like, oh yeah, which is a lot different than a lot of our other ists that we carry with us. A lot of times we are less isty, but we don't like being called out about it. But this one, we're all so ageist and we talk about it, we can really get in there and work with it. So there's a lot of room for us to grow. That's the reason why I love it the most. There's a lot of room for us to grow here as human beings, all of us. And we're so immersed with ideas that old is bad that I think it will be hard for some of it to, it's going to sink in. So all of us carry a little bit of this with us. So just because we aren't being nasty to someone doesn't mean we aren't discriminating against them. For instance, many people say they don't talk to older adults about modern topics, and I talked about this a lot already, and they'll say things like older people are set in their ways, or because, the younger person's being respectful, we don't want to get into it. I think both of these could be huge cop-outs. Guess what? All of us are set in our ways. People don't love changing, especially not their morals nor their opinions. It's not an old people thing. It's a people thing. A people thing, minus the quotation marks. We don't like changing. None of us like it. And that's why heated discussions about politics, they're heated. They're heated. We get passionate, all of us. Also, when we say we are respectful, but we don't believe that someone can change their mind, or that we could ever change our mind in talking to them, is that really respect? Also, do you catch yourself saying things like, oh, I'm having a senior moment when you forget a name or when you lose something? The reality of it is that when we chart things like this empirically, younger people are likely to report making these mistakes less than what they actually do. And older adults report more. So this over and under reporting shows us how our stereotypes, our emotions, and all of these things, our ageism, creeps in to our subconscious, and it actually alters how we perceive reality. And that's not to say that as we age we don't lose things like our short-term memory and all those other things we talked about, but it does highlight that our perceptions can fool us. And as this chapter in my notes point out, the consequences of putting someone into a box because of their perceived old age status are powerful. They're powerful for well-being, for physical health, for emotional health of the older adults. So be honest and open in your discussion posts, please. And please, check yourself, and you're going to want to do it. At least one of you is going to want to do it. Avoid cliche statements like, you're only as old as you feel. You can stay young. No, you can't. No, you can't. I wrote it over here, old is beautiful. It's a nice reminder. We never hear that, okay? What are you saying when you say things like, you're only as old as you feel? You're saying you're only as frail, sad, tired. And that's what old means to you when you say that. What if we flip that? Aging is inevitable. It is inevitable. And if we really had respect for it, we wouldn't say that we can or we should avoid it. We will welcome it. You'd never say that you're only as female as you feel. I hope not. Or you're only as male. Or you're only as Catholic. Or as Republican as you feel. You just wouldn't say that. So be fair to older adults and old age too, please. You'll be a part of this outgroup too, someday.